right. Though this journey's tall, is a mountain high. Though the wind she burns me like an ageless flame, she will give me strength so I can move again. Though my people may not be many, we are ready for the storm to come. And though my people may not be many, we are ready to be strong as one. And though my people travel like they are willing to fight the fight. Find a way, let it be done, let it be done. Toil to keep the faith until the storm has broken. Yeah. We got to find a way. I wanna rise above the breaking he brings within the sea. Ooh. Though my people may not be many, we are ready for the storm to come. Though my people may not be many, we are ready to be strong as one. Hey. Though my people travel like they are willing to fight the fight. Though my people may not be many, we are ready.
Good morning, guys. It's just after midday on the 28th of January 2020, and you're listening to podcast number 38, which I've entitled Heredom. It's a balmy 30 degrees Celsius today, and there's still a lot of smog in the air from the bushfires in Australia. So we've had now, a couple of months of breathing that rubbish, getting sore sinuses, itchy eyes, and there's still no sign in sight of those fires abating yet. So the atmosphere here looks really smoggy, especially on a day like today. And it's changed the weather patterns here, so summer has been pretty unusual. Normally a day like today will be hot all day, cloudless sky, and be up to about 31, 32, but the weather forecast for this afternoon is rain, so I'm hurriedly trying to get this podcast done this morning while it's still clear and sunny. So this podcast comes by way of a bit of a intermission between the last podcast, which was about the process of successfully dealing with the Guardian on the threshold, and the next podcast, which is going to be the first of the discussions on the advanced training. And I want to insert this particular podcast here because I've had a couple of requests to cover this subject, and I think it's probably a good idea while we're talking about the advanced training to actually give some background as to how all this information came about in the first place. Because it's one thing for me to be saying this is how things are, and this is based on my experience, and this is what we know historically, etc. But not offering some kind of detailed information about the research group that has existed behind this information. Means that there are some of you who are sitting here watching these videos thinking to themselves, all this is good and fine for this guy to be saying this, but what's the backstory? What's the background behind where all this information came from? So we're going to deal with that today before we continue on, so that when I start talking about the serious advanced stuff, everybody will have some kind of understanding about how all this information and these techniques came about. So the story goes like this. I began study and research into hypnosis when I was very young. I think I started seriously trying to hunt down information on hypnosis when I was about 9 years of age. When I was 11 years of age, based on my private research and study, which I had done without anybody knowing I had an interest in the subject and was actively trying to learn about it. When I was 11 years old, I performed my first successful hypnotic induction, which is an unusual situation because even adults who get trained properly usually find the first few times of trying to take somebody into a hypnotic state to be a bit difficult and messy. But for an 11-year-old who was self-trained, to achieve something like that is very unusual. Then when I was 18 years old, I brought a correspondence course, a short correspondence course that taught you how to achieve learn and achieve what used to be called clinical hypnotic induction. And I taught myself that, and again I had immediate success with that process, and it wasn't long before a number of my friends were aware that I was studying this and that I was good at it, and they offered to become subjects for me to experiment on. And then over the years between 18 and about 23, 24, I hypnotized hundreds of people. Most of them were friends or acquaintances of friends. And some of those people, a small group of them who were extremely good hypnotic subjects, allowed me to experiment on them on regular occasions, in exchange for me doing things in hypnosis with them that they were interested in, and they in turn would allow me to perform hypnotic induction on them in order to research the kind of things that I was interested in, which largely amounted to my wanting to use hypnosis in order to investigate the realm of psychic abilities. Whether things like astral projection and psychometry and things like that were real, and whether it was possible to use hypnosis to awaken or emphasize those psychic faculties. So a lot of the psychological reading that I did back in those days was focused on my search for new things to investigate, and then come up with techniques in order to experiment to see whether I could discover whether or not these were latent faculties of the psyche and could be awakened through hypnosis, or whether they were complete myth, that they were just things that had come down through history that weren't actually possible. Then when I was about 25, I applied to an American organization which at the time was offering training in hypnosis all over the world, or in a number of places internationally, and they just happened to be starting their first round of training sessions in New Zealand. And the outcome of those trainings, they were 2 weeks at first and then 3-week trainings. I went to 3 years worth of them, and the outcome was qualification as a professional hypnotherapist. So by the time I was 25, I had a well-developed experience and background in the study of psychology, and in particular the study of hypnosis and the use of hypnosis for investigating the mind. That was my primary concern back then, digging around inside people's heads to find out exactly what was there and what you could do with it. So by the time I technically became very interested in actual Western Hermetic science, let's put it that way, Western Hermetic science, when I was about 21 or 22, I already had quite a deep background in the nature of awakening psychic abilities and some of the functions that were associated with spiritual self-development. Then when I was about 23, 24, I was introduced to a local woman here by an astrologer who I had been going to get readings from, astrological readings, and she was teaching me a bit of basic astrology to see whether or not I wanted to take some of her night classes in astrology. She introduced me to a local woman here who was a practicing laboratory alchemist. She also owned the only esoteric bookshop in the central North Island of New Zealand, and so I became good friends of her because I was spending a lot of time buying books from her bookshop because of my newly awakened interest in Western Hermetism. So she eventually agreed to take me on as a student. Now this woman this laboratory alchemist had been a close confidant of the famous alchemist Frate Albertus. And Frate Albertus had first visited New Zealand in 1969. And the woman who was supposed to be his aide-de-camp while he was here became very ill, and they needed somebody to replace her, and it turned out to be the woman who ended up being my lab teacher. At that time she knew very little about laboratory alchemy, but very quickly learned the background and became very curious about it. And so while Frate Albertus was here in New Zealand teaching his first class in 1969, she was the one who was arranging accommodation for him, driving him around, and being his basically his girl Friday for the term of his visit here. So she became quite friendly with him, took the first class herself, the prima, and then was so excited by it that she then signed up for and attended the full 7-year training that Frate Albertus was offering in Utah through his Paracelsus College at the time. So she did the first year here, maybe the second year as well, and then completed the entire 7-year training by going to Utah every year to attend the whatever it was 2 or 3 week lab trainings at Frate Albertus's facilities in Utah. So also because of her peculiar position with Frate Albertus relative to New Zealand, and to a degree relative to Australia as well, because he also gave classes in Australia, my teacher knew everybody who had got involved in the alchemical training who was a New Zealander at the time. So when I met her almost 20 years later, when she told me that she was the only working lab alchemist still studying and producing alchemical products in New Zealand, I knew that she could make a statement like that with a complete understanding of everybody in the country, because New Zealand is a very small country. Back then we only had 3 million people in a population of a country that's the size of the United Kingdom. So it was very easy for her to know who had kept up their training and who hadn't. And by that time, when I met her, she was the only person who still had a lab and was still practicing what Frate Albertus had taught, and she was also the only person who had graduated the full 7-year training course. So out of a very unusual situation, mixture of events which came to pass when I first started looking for esoteric knowledge and an education in proper Western Hermetism, those connections came together for me to end up meeting basically the only person in the country who could deliver me a proper education face to face in laboratory alchemy. And even today, to try and get such a training where you learn everything there is to learn about alchemy, generally speaking, face to face with a teacher who has had a full and proper education themselves, that kind of a training relationship is even still today extremely rare. If you find yourself being trained by somebody who has a lab, who is practicing regularly, who is trained by an expert themselves, and you're attending regular trainings with that person face to face and learning from them, you are in one of the rarest situations where learning alchemy is concerned, because most people study the subject on their own, from books and from talking on forums and from reading blogs, trying to solve all the enigmas of laboratory alchemy on their own. Over the years, there have been a couple of large organizations which have taught a respected quality of alchemical knowledge, but these organizations rarely last, and most of the people who belong to them only attend workshops and don't really find themselves involved in being trained by an actual teacher face to face. So what this meant was that by the time I was roughly 25 years of age, I had a long background in training in the basics of the inner work, although I didn't at that point really understand what that meant, and I still had the most important things to discover about that situation ahead of me at that time when I was 25. Plus I had a personal laboratory teacher who was training me in everything that she had been taught by Frada Albertus, and that training lasted 9 years, which involved me going to her house and working in her lab every Saturday for 9 years. I may have missed 1 or 2 Saturdays, but pretty much I made sure I was there for every instruction, and sometimes I went on other days, like on a Sunday as well, or sometimes during the week, depending on what kind of things needed to be achieved in the lab at that time. So in the course of my training with her in the lab, I also became involved in a number of other esoteric adventures which added to the quality of my education in the long term. But I recognized very quickly, because this woman was the only active laboratory alchemist in New Zealand, and we're talking about the late 1980s here, before the internet, or before anybody even knew there was going to be such a thing as the internet, my immediate concern about what she was teaching me was that because New Zealand was very geographically isolated, and it was very difficult to get anybody to come here to teach or to provide reliable information or anything like that. Because she was getting on in age and I was accumulating this massive information and experience from her, that it became important for me to take seriously the idea of preserving this knowledge for New Zealand's esoteric future. Because out of all of the other esoteric enterprises which are relatively well known to have been going on in New Zealand at that time, nobody understood anything about laboratory alchemy. Even on an international level, most people in other areas of Western Hermetic study still hadn't come to grips with what alchemy really was and what it could provide to the overall tradition of Western Hermetism at that stage. So I realised that what I was doing in being this woman student was placing me in a position of responsibility to preserve this knowledge. So one of the things that I did at that time was encouraged her through her bookshop. She had a lot of correspondence students, to try and find a small number of other young people that she could teach lab to, so that we could form a small group and focus on not only studying what she had to teach, but also developing the knowledge that she was passing on through research in order to expand what we understood. And what that meant was that we ended up with a small group of 6 individuals, a couple of my friends and some people from her mail order lists that were local, who were interested in studying alchemy and took it on part-time. So when we had that small group of 6 students working with my teacher, we all got together one Saturday afternoon at her house and agreed that we were going to formally start a group that had 3 intentions. One of them was to study and preserve the information that we were being taught by our teacher. The second intention was to further that study through research. And the third intention was to create an environment in New Zealand where the preservation, research and handing on of that knowledge could be done without any kind of interference from, let's say, outside forces. So the third intention for the group was to create an environment which would foster the preservation and research and passing on of the information that we were learning. So that original group we called the Society of the Southern Cross, and over the next couple of years some of the members of that original 6 people fell away from the group, but those of us who remained ended up, through my teacher, making contact with a husband and wife team in New Zealand who were involved in the Golden Dawn system and who had been, let's say, interacting with people from the famous Whare Ra temple of the Golden Dawn in New Zealand. So they had a somewhat tenuous connection to the authentic old Golden Dawn tradition. So we made contact with this husband and wife team, and they agreed that if we could hold our alchemical study group together for another year and start slowly absorbing the study of the Golden Dawn system into our little group, that after that year that they would provide a situation for us where we could be initiated into the Golden Dawn and found our own Golden Dawn temple here in Hawke's Bay where I live. Now the reason why we made the decision to get our little group involved with the Golden Dawn was because we had no, we were reasonably naive about how esoteric groups worked and how we should conduct our group in particular. And again, we've got to remember, this is in the pre-internet days, and we didn't have access to a lot of really good information like people do today about how esoteric groups are run and the kinds of obstacles that the people who are running the groups have to overcome in order to make these groups productive. So we felt that becoming involved in the Golden Dawn would give us a proper structure That was the first thing. But the second thing was Frade Albertus' system always had one major weakness, and that was, while he was insisting that what he was teaching was an all-round version of alchemy, and that meant laboratory alchemy and what is most commonly called spiritual alchemy, the reality is Frade Albertus had no idea about the spiritual side of the Western mystery tradition or the alchemical tradition. He was just patching things together from a few people who he knew who had been involved in spiritual or magical streams of teaching themselves. But I went through what Frade Albertus considered to be his spiritual alchemy teachings, and really they were extremely pathetic. And even at my very early age of study of the Western mystery tradition in those days, around 25, 26 years of age, I still already knew enough to know that Frade Albertus knew next to nothing about things like Kabbalah that he had infused into his so-called spiritual teaching. So because Albertus's system was lacking that side of a proper, full alchemical training, we went looking for that side of things in other places and did a lot of research and a lot of experimenting in our little group and discussion and trying to decide how we would run a spiritual facet of alchemical teaching. And what that did was eventually led me into researching the Golden Dawn and then getting involved with this group in Wellington. And fortunately, I can say today, for all the problems that the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn has had, particularly in modern times and particularly since the internet went public in the late 90s, the original teachings of the Golden Dawn system contain knowledge and a history which is authentic as far as somebody trying to get their head around a proper understanding of Western Hermetic internal work, particularly initiation and the process of spiritual self-development. So we stayed involved with the Golden Dawn for about 4 years until it got to the stage where it became obvious that the people in Wellington who had made promises to us about providing us with initiation and proper training, official training from an alleged authentic branch of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, those promises fell through after all kinds of negotiation and trying to make it work, and we decided that following that path was no longer viable. So we began again working on the internal alchemical work and a system that we could use in order to research and develop that internal work into a process that was reliable and was historically authentic. So around that same time, I was also coming to the end of my hypnotherapy qualification training and had learned enough about human psychology, psychotherapy, and the application of that knowledge to spiritual self-development in order to begin to carry out work on the core members of our group, where we did meditational type sessions designed to discover and put together a proper esoteric training system for the inner work. So that research and development was continued for about another 4 years until the internet first came to New Zealand, and I went online about 95, 96, and at that point we decided that we would start advertising the training that we were offering online. And then in 2002, after purging the group of a lot of people who were just hanging around and not doing the work, or who were misbehaving, in 2002 we did a restructure of the original group. We formulated a clean and tidy system for teaching lab work and the inner work, and we took on the name the Heredom group at that time. And the system that we began to formalize at that point was the beginning of the training that I provide, or that we provide today, 18 years later. So all of this information which I am talking about in these podcasts, the theory, the experience, and when I discuss the system behind all of this, which made all of this understanding possible, what we are talking about here is the Heredom group. The name Heredom itself comes from Freemasonry. Historically, it is believed, one of the theories about the origins of Freemasonry is that it came originally from an esoteric group of some kind in Europe or the UK, and that this esoteric group wanted to formulate for themselves a kind of an outer school, or a sort of a kindergarten, where it would bring in lots of average spiritual seekers, and then from that large group of members it could select the best individuals for initiation into that, what must have been a secret society back then. In historic Masonic documents that go back into the early 1600s, the title for that group was given various names, because most people spelled the English language phonetically back then. There was no proper standard for how words were spelled, but the standard term for that original mother group became known as Heredom, or chapters of Heredom, like lodges of Heredom. And the Heredom group were then known as the Ancients, and the new organisation that was created, modern Freemasonry, was known as the Moderns. And modern Freemasonry had references in it to the original mother group, the Heredom group, and some allusions to the kind of information that it taught, but Freemasonry itself, by and large, had all the esoteric part of the Heredom group stripped away from it. Some of it still remained, but most of it was stripped away from it. And the little amount that remained in Freemasonry was only there as a kind of spoiler alert for people who were seeking deeper knowledge to push their way deeper into Freemasonry until they found the doorway into what was at that time known as the Heredom group. So we chose that organisation, of course, eventually disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to it, which is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to find research on the actual origins of Freemasonry, especially people who have no real understanding of how esoteric fraternities work. When they start trying to research things like the origins of Freemasonry, they come up against a brick wall because they don't understand the degree of secrecy that those groups worked under and what happens to those groups when they disappear, basically leaving no trace of, or next to no trace of themselves. So out of homage to that original group that gave birth to Freemasonry, we decided to call the group that we were running online in 2002 the Heredom group. And we were offering training in the lab tradition and initiation in the inner work, because by that time in 2002 we had designed and put together and were delivering a full range of initiatory tools in order to achieve what is commonly referred to in the Western mystery tradition as knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel, or what we call knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. And this is an important factor about the place that the Heredom group plays in the broader field of modern Western Hermetic teaching, because it will be generally agreed by most of the various different kinds of Western mystery tradition schools that exist in the mainstream, that means the popular level of teaching, that the goal of the Western Hermetic mystery tradition is to advance students towards a state of them becoming one with their higher self, as the more new agey end of the scale would call it, or to have knowledge and conversation with the higher genius, which those at the more technically accurate end of the scale would refer to it. So this is generally agreed to be the primary goal of whatever you're being trained in the school that you have chosen and belong to. And there are various different types of school in the Western Hermetic tradition. The problem is that while these schools advertise that they are authentic, many of them advertise that they are authentic and that they are the present guardians of a long tradition and that they have a pedigree, the problem is that 99% of these schools don't deliver on the promise of being able to train you up to the point where you achieve knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. Now, I know there are a bunch of people who are listening to this who will probably absolutely insist that what I've just said is not true, that there are schools, or that they know schools, or that they know people who have achieved knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. And to those naysayers, I will say this, that in my journey through being involved with and studying in seriously with sincere commitment the Western Hermetic mystery tradition, now for almost 30 years being involved in that journey, I have been a member of a number of organisations which are considered to be the most advanced and respected teachers of authentic Hermetism. I mostly don't agree about what they claim where that's concerned, but where the mainstream population who are studying Hermetism is concerned, when you ask people to name the organisations which they believe are the most authentic and technically proficient, there are a number of names which virtually everybody will repeat. And at the top of that list is probably the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Most people agree that it is the most technically proficient, modern, mainstream Hermetic school. And then second to the Golden Dawn, which of course I was involved in, so I've seen the entire thing from the beginning to the end, as I was one of the chiefs of the temple that we were helped to found. I've seen the entire system from beginning to end, including the fact that I have owned and read and studied original documents from the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn never succeeded in providing proper training to actually help anybody who followed those instructions properly to achieve knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. So the second tier below the Golden Dawn are all the groups who have become offshoots of the Golden Dawn, or groups that were created in the post-Golden Dawn era using the Golden Dawn system as their primary format, shall we say, because the Golden Dawn was considered the most technically proficient school since the turn of the last century, the early 1900s. Anybody who was creating a new school basically went to the Golden Dawn documents and used those documents as the basis for their own system. Some people deny that. Some schools teach without actually giving credit to the Golden Dawn that that's what they're actually teaching is a Golden Dawn system or their version of it. But it's agreed that the best schools in the mainstream today are either the Golden Dawn or schools that are offshoots of the Golden Dawn, or that are based on the Golden Dawn system. Amongst those, most people will agree, is an organisation that was started by a man called Paul Foster Case, and that organisation is called Builders of the Adytum. Paul Foster Case was a Golden Dawn initiate, but for whatever reason he decided to go off and found his own group called Builders of the Adytum, and today it's one of the biggest and most respected schools in the Hermetic Western tradition. I was also a member of BOTA for years, and not a lot of people who know about BOTA know that the leadership for that organisation was based in New Zealand for a long time, and at the time I was involved, the guy who was running BOTA International was Will Chesterman. Because New Zealand is a small country, and because I was deeply involved in Builders of the Adytum, I got to meet Will Chesterman a lot. I got to hear him talk a lot, and I got to meet all of his flunkies that he kept close to him, the people in positions of authority. I even got to meet the guy who was being groomed to take over from Will when Will died, which he did eventually do while I was still a member. So I knew all the people at the top of BOTA. In other words, these people, because BOTA has such a lot of respect amongst Western Hermetic students who are serious about their study and being involved in group work, what this meant by insinuation was that the people who were at the top of BOTA and running that system ideally should have been among the most advanced adepts in the Western mystery tradition. And again, Like with Frada Albertus, one of the things I learned from hobnobbing with those people was that they actually knew very little. Most of them were businessmen who had the ability to run businesses and therefore were the best choice to pick to run a large international organization. So they had that business background of organizing and keeping an organization running, but their esoteric knowledge was severely lacking. Amongst the rank and file members and builders of the Diatom, there were lots of people who knew far more than the people who were running that organization. I was also a member of Philosophers of Nature, which was one of the biggest modern schools that taught laboratory alchemy. It was founded by a French gentleman by the name of Jean Dubuis. It was originally founded in France, but then he made friends with people who had been connected with Frada Albertus in the United States, and the Philosopher's Nature was then exported to the United States, and a branch was set up there, and from there everything was translated from French into English, and then the whole system was spread across the globe. And for the amount of time that the Philosopher's Nature was running, it could definitely be said have been said to have been the largest modern alchemical instruction organization that's existed, certainly in memory. We don't know of any strictly alchemical organization that was really bigger than Philosopher's Nature got. My teacher first learnt about them, and then we both became members, and then she got close enough to the inner group of Philosopher's Nature to be put in the position of being the distributor of their instruction course, their correspondence course in Oceania in the South Pacific. So because of her close connection with the people who were running Philosophers of Nature in America, again I found myself in a position where I was watching, listening to, and evaluating the people who were at the top of one of the most respected organizations of its kind in that day and at that time. And so I got to know who those guys were, how they thought, exactly what they knew, how good they were at solving problems, and of course, where spiritual self-development was concerned, how far these people had got in that area themselves. And once again, the same story. And this is across the board in the mainstream. These people all had good intentions, but they had no real understanding of the inner work of the Hermetic tradition, for all the knowledge, interesting and helpful knowledge that they had about the actual laboratory work itself. Then lastly, of most importance, I had become a Freemasoner. And the reason why I joined Freemasonry was because Freemasonry was the mother of modern Western Hermetism. There was a time during the 1700s, end of the 1600s into the early 1700s, where the whole Western mystery tradition virtually collapsed. Nobody really knows why that happened, and very few people pay any attention to that fact, because a lot of people don't care about the history of the tradition, and certainly very few people have done any form of research into the early history of the Western mystery tradition, Hermetic mystery tradition. But what happened was that as the hardcore pre-18th century Hermetic Western tradition started to collapse, the best parts of that were preserved inside of Freemasonry. even though Freemasonry itself did not teach esoteric knowledge, and it was not part of the standard system that you were delivered as a Freemason, people who were involved in teaching esoteric knowledge attached themselves to Freemasonry because it was a good place to look for spiritual seekers. And because of that, Freemasonry nurtured underground the Western Hermetic tradition until around the time of the birth of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which then was the start of a new explosion of interest in Western Hermetism. When the Freemasons who created the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn started to have internal problems in that organisation, one of the first things that happened was some of the members, out of fear that the Golden Dawn was going to collapse and disappear, published all of the teaching of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And when they did that and people got a look at what was being taught in these very secretive Western Hermetic tradition schools, they got all excited and decided to use that information to build new schools. And so we ended up with a kind of a renaissance in the modern mainstream tradition. And it's important to understand that this is mainstream occultism, because when these people were trying to rebuild and re-give birth to the Western mystery tradition, one of the problems they had is that they didn't possess the keys to successful practical work. They had a lot of intellectual information, but they didn't have the techniques that were required to actually move people along the pathway of spiritual self-development. So they tried all kinds of things, and some of them kind of succeeded a little bit, but for the most part, those well-intending people that were trying to give rebirth to the Western mystery tradition, in the end had to resort to going to the Far East and to the yoga tradition in order to find practical techniques that would allow them to deliver a form of practical spiritual self-development work inside these new fraternities that they were building. And of course, the yogis in the Far East were not stupid. They didn't want to hand over their secrets to these new, fresh clowns from the West who are hunting desperately for practical keys to the mysteries. So what happened was most of the Eastern mystical practices that were learned by the Westerners and brought back to the West were learned from the popular or mainstream level of teaching in the East. In other words, it was largely rubbish. It all sounded authentic, and of course the Westerners had no way of discerning properly what was authentic in the East. They just had to take the word for it of the people who were offering to pass on this hidden secret knowledge to them. What we know now in the 21st century, looking back, is that the information that those people from the 1800s learned in the Far East was not the real initiated yogic teaching. We know all this went on because in the groups that were created out of the Golden Dawn system and alongside the Golden Dawn system in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, what we know about these groups is if you join them, like I did, get into the inner levels of their teaching, like I did, and start getting the instruction on their secret processes, which will help you along the path of spiritual self-development, those processes are not Western tradition. They are processes that were taken from the Far East. And what this immediately tells us is that these people did actually not have access to the true practical techniques of the Western tradition. One of the things that the Golden Dawn did from the point when it was created was it recognized this problem in the groups around it that were forming in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s. And what the Golden Dawn said was, we're not going to put anything of Eastern extract into our system. Everything that we're going to teach is going to be Egyptian, Greek, and Roman. And therefore we can then claim that we are a pure Western mystery tradition school. Now, they actually did include one thing in their training, and it was an important thing that came from the East and was not part of the Western tradition, and that was the Tatwa system that they taught, I think, at the 4th grade in the Outer Order. But nevertheless, they recognized this problem of people sticking pseudo-Eastern practices into their secret inner order teachings and then trying to pass them off as being guardians of the authentic Western mystery tradition, which they obviously weren't. But most students of occultism are naive and would not even have recognized that there was a dichotomy going on there, a problem between being these organizations saying that they were authentic Western, when in fact what they were teaching was watered down Eastern practices. So I've digressed a bit, but what is the point in going over this whole history of what happened to the Western mystery tradition and where it places us today? And the point is that it has led to a situation where we have a lot of groups that are claiming to be authentic Western mystery tradition, but who are not delivering. They are saying that the goal is knowledge and conversation with the higher genius, however they say that in their own language, but they actually have no proper technique for reliably delivering that process. And this is the difference with the Heredom group. Because of our background, because we didn't just create a system and then deliver it and just keep it the same and just pass it on no matter whether it was authentic or not, we actually did research. Hardcore, scientifically based psychological research in order to discover an authentic and historically authentic Western Hermetic training, inner work training, that is actually initiatory and does effectively and reliably deliver knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. This is why the Heredom system is so important, because we're virtually one of the only schools today who can make the claim that if you follow our instruction exactly, you will achieve knowledge and conversation with the higher genius. And not only that, that achievement is what legend has claimed about it. It is as important and powerful as legend has claimed it to be. So this puts the Heredom group in a bit of a unusual position where the knowledge that it has preserved, researched and developed, and which it passes on in its teaching, is very much a level above that which is delivered routinely in the mainstream. Because of this, people who have become involved with the Heredom group's training, either in the lab or in the inner work, because we offer 2 types of training. You can do them both, or you can do one or the other, have very quickly realized that we're not like being a member of one of these popular mainstream groups, that what we're delivering is very different, extreme and very serious, and that it actually works, and that it works very fast. One of the difficulties with delivering a system like that is that we've had to deal with a lot of people who are not sincere, and also a lot of people who have become students with the conscious and deliberate intention of abusing what we're offering for their own ends, to other people's detriment. So it has caused us to have to develop a training system and a system of bringing people into training which is extremely strict, and that we dump students, expel them from training very quickly the moment we find out that they are in any way at all disrespecting or abusing what we're offering. Unlike other schools that are generally only concerned with bums on seats and how many people that they have as students so that they can make claims about being a big school, the Heredom group has no interest at all in numbers. What we are looking for strictly is quality of students. People who actually are sincere and who are intelligent enough and committed enough to make it to the top levels of the training that we offer. So for the greater part of Heredom's existence, which is almost 30 years now, maybe it is 30 years already, yeah, 30 years last year. For the greater part of Heredom's existence, our primary concern has not been with just offering training to anybody, but only of offering training to people who can reach a level of proficiency in their initiatory work and attaining knowledge and conversation with a higher genius, so that they can then be in a position to join us in our research and development work behind the scenes. That's largely our history. Up until a few years ago, we were only interested in people who were in that kind of position. Therefore, we had no entry level training. If you joined as a novice in Heredom with a one-on-one tuition with a tutor up until a couple of years ago, you had to have already had a robust background in study in the Western mystery tradition. Otherwise, when you started training with us, you just simply wouldn't know what the hell was going on, because you couldn't speak the language and you didn't have a proper conceptual base of understanding of ideas, philosophy, and the kinds of exercises, plus the way the Heredom group was structured as a traditional teaching system. So we had a lot of students who were failures because they lied their way into training, trying to convince us that they had a robust background in study, and then as soon as they started studying with us, it became obvious that they had nowhere near enough understanding of the Western mystery tradition or mainstream practices in large respected schools in order to make their way effectively through our training. And we simply didn't have enough time or enough resources through our teachers, who were doing everything voluntarily, in order to take students right back to the nitty-gritty and start teaching them all the basics. All of that, though, has changed in the last couple of years. And we've spent the last 5 or 6 years behind the scenes working away at developing an entry level training course, because our research and development mission has almost completely come to an end. The things that we wanted to achieve have almost completely been rounded off and completed. And so, having finished our research and development into both the inner work in order to produce a proper, reliable, effective inner work training and a proper, reliable, effective lab work training, we now are in a position where we can pass on that knowledge to other people who have a serious, intelligent and committed approach towards serious, authentic Western Hermetic teaching, and whose own personal goals in the long run are spiritual self-development, because that is the focus that we revolve around. Everything that we teach, everything that we do is aimed at achieving reliable, fully effective spiritual self-development. So for the most part, that explains where all the information in these podcasts came from. A lot of very difficult research and development that was done very scientifically with hundreds of students over 30 years, where we were getting students to carry out exercises, write full and detailed, truthful reports about their experiences, and then we would compare students' experiences in order to extrapolate an understanding of reliable events that were repeatedly happening and were forming patterns, and then to work our way down those paths in order to find approaches to lab work and to the inner work which were repeatably reliable, and that we can actually explain the mechanics of these processes and how they work, which is another thing that's missing from the mainstream. You're often taught practical exercises, but nobody ever explains how they work or why they're supposed to work, because they simply don't know why or how. The Heredom group is a different situation altogether. Everything we teach, we can explain how and why it works, and if it doesn't work, we know exactly why it hasn't worked and what needs to be done in order to remedy that, which makes being a student in our system very difficult for a lot of people who can't follow instructions properly. Okay, so I think for this podcast, that is pretty much everything I wanted to say until we move, before we moved on to the next stage in my explanations of the initiatory process, because we're now going to start talking about things from this point on, which I know a lot of very serious seekers will have thought about a lot, will have even searched for and investigated a lot, and have never found answers to. And the kinds of things I'm going to start talking about from now on are answers to some very serious issues for people who have a very serious interest in attaining the summit of personal spiritual self-development. And when I say serious, I don't mean you just want it. I want it. That means I'm serious. That's not what serious means. Serious means people who will commit themselves to study, will commit themselves to practices which have extreme effects on your life, and who are committed to work to actually work and struggle through a process which does provide results quicker than any other system that we are presently aware of. So the last thing I have to say before we end this podcast is I just mentioned that we've been developing a entry level training course. We're actually just at the beginning of starting to deal with that whole situation, and we're calling that project the Heredom College. We actually have a website and a platform to deliver an education in the entry level instruction that is required for our advanced training, and we are hoping that towards the middle of 2020, or maybe a little bit towards the end of 2020, we will be launching Heredom College and taking on our first intake of students into that entry level training before 2021. And you'll find a link down below in the description box to our website for Heredom College, where you can sign up to our email newsletter in order to get updates on how we're going with developing the college program. It's a lot of hard work, and it's a struggle at the moment amongst all the other things that we're trying to juggle inside of the group in order to get the instruction course to a level of professional quality that we want, but we're hoping that it will all be done towards the middle or the end of this year with any luck. Anyone who's interested in knowing about how that's being developed should check out that link in the description box below and sign up for that email newsletter at the Heredom College website. So once again, thank you very much for watching. Anybody who has any questions about the Heredom group or about Heredom College, please include those questions in the comments if you want to get replies from me, and I will reply to you either in the comments or via email, or in a future podcast I'll do a Q&A and put all those questions together, because I do understand that knowing about the organization that is behind these podcasts, and that puts me in a position to speak from a position of authority about the stuff that I'm talking about. I know it's important for people to understand how all that works and how it developed and where it is in the scheme of things. So if I've missed anything out here or haven't said enough that some people want to understand about the Heredom group, please feel free to ask questions in the comments below. And hopefully I'll see you in the next podcast, which will be titled something along the lines of contacting the higher functions.
Though my hands are cold and my mouth is dry, though this journey's tall is a mountain high, though the wind she burns me like an ageless flame, she will give